In this video, we're going to be talking about the 8 most common misconceptions that I run into when teaching people how to mix their music. Let's get started. The number 1 misconception is that effects are 90% of your mix. This is absolutely not true. The 90% of the mix is actually the volume balance. It's the opposite. So I always teach people to volume balance, then EQ, then compress, then use effects. Not necessarily exactly in that order, but pretty close. And that's also the order in which things are the most important. The volume balance is by far the most important part of your mix. Effects are the last 1%-ish. Effects can definitely add some additional interesting characteristics to the mix, but ultimately that's not going to fix a mix. And oftentimes you'll run into amateur mixers that just add and add and add more effects to their mix, thinking that that is the secret to a professional mix, but they're actually probably harming their mix more than fixing it by adding these additional effects. Number 2 misconception about mixing is that references are going to inhibit my creativity when I am mixing. This is absolutely not true. And this kind of goes with the next point a little bit, so I'll try not to touch on it too much, but references you can kind of view as bumpers on a bowling alley, right? So they're basically to keep you from doing anything really stupid, like throwing a gutter ball right away. So essentially they're to keep you in line, and as long as you're relatively in this lane of going down the alley, then you're going to have a professional mix. And it's not going to inhibit you from, using effects creatively if that's really what you think is creative about mixing. But it's really to just keep you within those genre norms that are actually going to increase the perceived quality of your mix. Misconception number 3 is mixing is 100% subjective. And this, again, goes along with the last one about references, is that mixing is actually about 70% objective and then 30% subjective, meaning that there is an objective measure of what a professional mix is. And everybody inherently knows that, but they like to not really think about it when they're mixing because they think that it's going to inhibit their creativity. But if you approach it from an objective first mindset, then you'll know, okay, this is actually what an objective mix should sound like. And then you can add that 30% creative on top of it, right? Because there's a range essentially of where your vocals could be in a song that still is considered professional, and there's a range where your kick and your snare could be, and the creative decisions of what tone I want to use for my samples on my kick, right? There's definitely creative decisions. However, overall, there's an expected frequency distribution of all of your sound inside of your mix that sounds professional, and it roughly matches pink noise. Tidbit for you. But if you approach it from an objective first mindset, you're much, much more likely to get a professional sounding mix rather than if you approach it from a subjective first mindset. Misconception number 4 is that you should high pass all your tracks immediately, right away. That is definitely not true. You'll end up with a very thin and weak sounding mix if you do this. Obviously, there is a time to high pass certain elements, but it's not nearly as often as most people think. I only high pass when I hear an issue inside of the mix. If there's something that's obviously building up in the 30 hertz range, obviously I'm going to high pass it if it's not the kick or the bass guitar or something. But more often than not, I don't high pass anything except for maybe 1 or 2 elements in my mix that are causing issues. Number 5 is that plugins will give your mix an edge. And this is absolutely not true. I have actually reverted back to using way more stock plugins than I ever have in the past because I realized it's not about the gear. It's about the skill and how you're approaching your mix. Avoiding a lot of premium plugins, I'm actually more confident with my mixes because sometimes the premium plugins just look so cool that I think I'm making great decisions when I'm in reality not making very good decisions with my mix. So sometimes the more boring looking plugins are actually better because they don't confuse you visually. And then secondly, using more stock plugins makes my computer run a lot more efficiently, and therefore it's easier and just more convenient for me to mix the song, as I don't have any bogging down of my CPU that is then impacting my ability to just get things done quickly inside of my mix. Misconception number 6 is you should always cut with EQ and never boost. This is a completely logical fallacy. Let me explain why. If I say cut at any frequency and then bring up the volume again on the back end to basically match the levels before and after the cut overall, I'm actually inherently boosting all of those frequencies that I didn't actually cut. Because inherently an EQ is just a fancy volume knob that allows you to either boost or cut different frequencies rather than just the whole track. There's like phase dispersion and whatever else that is introduced when you're using EQ. But ultimately, at a very simplistic level, just view it as a volume knob that's fancy enough that I can boost and cut different frequencies. But ultimately, I want my volume before and after that move to be the same. And so I'm inherently going to be boosting or cutting everywhere in the frequency spectrum. Don't be afraid to boost with an EQ, completely fine. But I would say to rein in your moves to 3 decibels or less, either boosting or cutting. The reason for that is you're going to avoid over mixing your song, and also 3 decibels is a massive change if you look at it scientifically, which ultimately is going to cause you to have a much more professional mix. Most of the time when you look at professional mixing engineers' sessions, they are not very complex. They have a couple plugins and they're making very small moves. They're just making the right moves to make sure that their mix sounds pro. Number 7 is compression is your first choice when you have dynamic issues inside of your mix. This is not true. Your first choice should be either volume automation or gain staging. So gain staging is my number 1 tool that I like to use to fix dynamic issues inside of my mix, because it avoids additional processing that I don't need to go through, because compression can oftentimes make your mix sound really dead if you use too much of it, because it sucks the life and the dynamic micro dynamics out of your track, and then all of a sudden it just doesn't sound real anymore, and therefore it doesn't convey the same emotion that the performance originally had. When you have overly dynamic tracks, don't reach immediately for compression. I would reach first for a gain staging, then compressor, and then at the end, I would do volume automation to make up for dynamics that were then sucked away by using compression. Volume automation is a really powerful tool to add some dynamics back to the track after you're done mixing. You're done with the majority of your mix to be able to increase the dynamics of like builds and fades and things like that. Can be really, really powerful by using some automation there. Okay, and then number 8, the very last misconception is mastering will fix your amateur mix. Mastering will absolutely not do that. Mastering can make it slightly better, but inherently it's limited by what you're giving it. Mastering is going to do one thing for your mix. It's going to enhance everything, including the things you actually don't like about your mix. It's still going to enhance that. Mastering engineers will try to, de-emphasize the things that aren't great about the mix and balance it better sonically. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do from a mastering perspective. And so mastering won't fix an amateur mix. It can add that extra layer of, 5% better, but is not going to inherently fix the majority of the mix. If you only have a limited budget and you're deciding between paying for mixing or paying for mastering, pay for mixing 100% of the time. It's going to give you a much better result, even if it's more expensive. And if you find yourself just randomly applying plugins in your mix, falling into some of these issues inside of your mix, then make sure you're picking up my ultimate mixing checklist. It's linked below, completely for free, completely for you. It's the same workflow that I still use to this day with every single mix that I do in order to be able to mix faster, focus more, and ultimately get way more professional results at the end of the day. So make sure you're picking that checklist up. And with that, I will catch you in the next video.